In the United States, there is a widespread belief that that young people are particularly well equipped to make sense of online information because they have grown up with digital devices, and folks believe that because students are so adept at using their smartphones, that they are also very good at making sense of the information and evaluating the information that those devices provide them. Unfortunately, we have evidence that this is simply not the case. We've conducted a nationwide survey in the United States of more than 3,000 high school students, a sample that reflects the population of high school students in the country. And we asked these students to evaluate real online sources with a live internet connection, and told them that they could search anywhere online in order to make their evaluations of these sources. We asked them to evaluate sites like this one, co2science.org, which refers to it itself as disseminating factual reports. But the website calls into question humans' role in global warming. And as a matter of fact, if you leave the website and do a search on the open internet for information about CO2 science, you will quickly find out that it has received backing from the fossil fuel industry, groups that have vested interest in doubting climate change science. And despite students having an internet, the ability to search anywhere online, 96% of them never found out about the link to the fossil fuel industry. And an even simpler task, we just showed students the homepage of Slate, the news magazine, and asked students to distinguish between news stories and advertisements. At the bottom left-hand corner, there is a post that is labeled sponsored content, and it indicates that it was paid for by IBM. Women, the real reason women don't go into tech. 2/3 of students thought that that was in fact a news story. They did not have the understanding of sponsored content in this entire genre of advertising. In short, the survey showed that students lack these crucial skills of being able to evaluate the kind of content that streams across their screens all the time. I'm just dropping into the chat a link to that study from Educational Researcher. So given those striking results and troubling results that suggest that students need much more assistance to be able to navigate effectively online, we wondered, how can we help students do better? What are a set of strategies that would allow them to more effectively sort fact from fiction on the internet? And to answer that question, we wanted to try to identify expertise in this realm. And so we took 3 groups of people and asked them to evaluate online sources. This was a study led by my colleagues Sam Weinberg and Sarah McGrew. And those 3 groups of people, each of whom spent a lot of time evaluating sources, were freshmen at Stanford University. So young people in the heart of Silicon Valley who spend a ton of time online. And then also history professors, folks who evaluate sources for their professional lives. And then finally, professional fact checkers from leading news outlets in the United States. And we presented them with unfamiliar websites like this one from minimumwage.com, and asked them to evaluate the source, to explain whether or not they think it is a credible source of information. And there were some really striking differences in how these groups evaluated sources like this one. Minimumwage.com indicates on its website that it is a project of the Employment Policies Institute, which is a, quote, nonprofit research organization dedicated to studying public policy issues. But if you leave the website and search for more information about it, you'll discover that, in fact, it is a website run by this guy, Rick Berman, who is public relations, owns a public relations firm, and has been referred to as corporate America's new scam. That he runs a whole host of websites that claim to be engaged in public policy research, when in fact they're working for particular corporate interests. However, despite that information being readily available to anybody who chose to do a new search about this organization, the Stanford students and the historians struggled to find that information. So for instance, only 40% of the Stanford students in the study ever located that information. The figures in red on this screen, or excuse me, they're the ones in green on this screen. And in contrast, only 60% of the historians in orange, and then the fact checkers are in red. All of the fact checkers figured out who was behind this website and understood that the vested interest of Berman and the people we work for, in this case, the food and beverage industry, who have a particular interest in keeping minimum wage low and trying to influence that public policy debate, that would really change the way you think about the credibility of this source of information. And that held for all of the tasks in the study. The fact checkers were much more effective and efficient at finding credible information, in contrast to these really smart people, the Stanford students and the historians, who took longer to figure this out and in many cases never actually discovered this information. And what distinguished the groups was something that seems on its face a little bit counterintuitive, which is, in order to understand a site, you need to leave it. And as we talked about in the last session, this key move of lateral reading, that instead of reading carefully on a single website, the fact checkers open new tabs in their browser and read across those tabs, reading what we've termed reading laterally. And by opening up those tabs and doing new searches, they found much more information and were better able to evaluate the credibility of the sources that they encountered. So the results were very striking, that there were clearly better approaches to finding and evaluating sources online. And what we wanted to do was try to take what we saw from that research and translate it into a curricular approach to use with young people. We refer to our curricular approach as civic online reasoning, which is a term that distinguishes it from the broader fields of media and digital literacy, which can embrace everything from creating videos to understanding the implication of one's digital footprint. Civic online reasoning narrows the focus by providing tools to efficiently sort through the avalanche of social and political messages that stream across our screens. And so we're not trying to create an army of mini fact checkers in our schools. Instead, we're trying to give students a small set of heuristics that they can quickly use to make sense of the information that they encounter whenever they pull a phone out of their pockets. And we have now done a series of studies to try out this approach, where we have implemented civic online reasoning curricular materials in classrooms and tested their efficacy. And others have as well. Just a couple of results that we have done, I'll drop into the chat. One was in a college classroom where we just did 2 75-minute sessions to introduce these skills of lateral reading to students, and saw improvement. In another one from the Harvard Misinformation Review, we actually did it in an asynchronous setting as well. My colleague Sarah McGrew also did a study with high school students. Angela Conan from the University of Florida has done something similar with middle school students. Our colleagues at Civics in Canada have worked with high school students as well. However, none of these studies have taken on trying to do this at scale. What does it mean to take an entire school district and implement this kind of study? And so that's what we set out to do with the present research. We wanted to see if we could implement civic online reasoning curriculum in a large urban school district. And so we worked with a school district that has more than 40,000 students in total as part of it, and implemented the study in all 6 high schools. We followed a matched control design where schools were matched based on the race and ethnicity of the students and the percentage of students enrolled in the free and reduced lunch program, so a proxy for socioeconomic status. And matched schools were assigned to opposite conditions. So 3 of the high schools were, the students there received civic online reasoning instruction, and the other 3 high schools students did not. And all of the government teachers in the spring semester that we ran this intervention participated in this study. What we did was try to follow a format that is familiar in terms of how new curricular approaches are integrated in school districts. That we first gave teachers a day of professional development, the kind of thing that school districts often provide for teachers when they implement a new curriculum. And then teachers over the course of 3 months just implemented 6 50-minute lessons. Each of those lessons provided teachers with lesson plans as well as handouts for students to use, and PowerPoint slides. And we, members of the research team, met with teachers over the course of the intervention to see if they had any questions about those resources. Cognitive apprenticeship was at the heart of the approach. We really wanted, more than anything, to teach students how to read laterally. And so we, in several instances, had the teachers modeling for students, what does lateral reading look like? How do you go about doing it? And then gave students opportunities to practice with real online content. We didn't want to give students canned sources. Instead, we provided them with real links, a range of sources, everything from very credible, trustworthy sources of information to deeply problematic ones, and asked them to evaluate them and then to discuss what they discovered about these sources based on their investigations online. So for instance, one of the lessons actually used that same minimum wage article that I mentioned before that we used in the study with the fact checkers. And the teacher modeled for students how to read laterally, how you can go from minimumwage.com, leave that to take a quick look at the Employment Policies Institute before searching about the Employment Policies Institute online to find a whole host of sources that give a much broader and precise description of what this organization is really up to. Everything from Last Week Tonight with John Oliver to 60 Minutes to the New York Times have described the group. So there's no shortage of sources. And so the teacher displaying their computer and thinking out loud as they go through it shows students how they read laterally and how that leads to better answers to their understanding of this given site. And then students were given the chance to practice those skills with new sources as well. In terms of measuring student growth over the course of this intervention, we used a pretest and post-test that had parallel forms. So they were the same questions at pretest and post-test, but with different stimulus. So for instance, at pretest, we asked students to evaluate another website that calls into question humans' role in global warming. In this case, it's friendsofscience.org. And then at post-test, we asked students the same question when they were with a different source. In this case, it is the this is the one about CO2 science that I showed before. So same question, but the stimulus has been shifted. In total, there were 7 constructed response items on the pretest and post-test. We scored those using extant rubrics. We'd used these assessments in a variety of previous studies. And then we used a multi-level mixed linear model to analyze those results, to account for the nested nature of the data. We used that multi-level linear model to test for the differences. And we tested whether students in the treatment group showed greater evidence of learning from pretest to post-test. And we included a series of covariates: race, ethnicity, gender, primary language spoken at home, hours spent online per day, and how frequently students checked whether online information was trustworthy. And we saw clear differences. Just with raw scores, we saw that students in the treatment classrooms did much better at post-test than at pretest. This is out a total of 14 points, though, so still students are getting less than half of the total possible points on the test, but it is undoubtedly better than students in the control classroom. We then did estimated change in student score from pretest to post-test after adjusting for all covariates, and we still see that significant change from pretest to post-test with the intervention. And you know what this tells us is that even with a modest intervention, we can see significant improvement, and that's really a crucial finding, right? So often we, especially in educational settings, have this belief that things are kind of hopeless, that there's nothing that we can do to prepare students for this current environment. And this shows very clearly that we can make a difference, and it's a modest intervention, right? That this was less than 6 hours of instruction. Common Sense Media has done a survey which suggests that that is less time than the average American teenager spends online in a single day. And so, you know, even though, you know, there is a lot of potential for further growth, right? We definitely would prefer that students are getting more than half right on this test. It still shows that, you know, with a small amount of effort, we can really help students improve in pretty dramatic ways. But we need to figure out how to better support students to do that, to do it better. What does it mean to get it so that students are getting most of these right? Some very basic kinds of skills, right? It's not super complex tasks. We just want them to be able to look into, you know, CO2 science, and many students still had a hard time doing that. And so it really speaks to the need for identifying approaches to integrating these kinds of ways of instruction more broadly. What are the ways in which we can integrate these materials into the school curriculum? And we think that it's going to be really critical that we don't make this an add-on, a barnacle on the hull of the curriculum. We need to identify ways to begin to integrate these ways of teaching and learning into the subject matters. So what does it look like if in history class, you could teach students how to evaluate online sources? Unfortunately, there's no shortage of deeply toxic content about historical topics. So there are lots of ways in which you could teach these skills. We've begun to do some of that work recently. We've been working with some high schools to help them identify key places in the curriculum where these kinds of ways of teaching can be part of core subject areas. So for instance, in a biology class, teachers have begun to figure out ways to teach civic online reasoning. So in a unit that talks about caffeine, we had students evaluate a website that claims to be showing scientific information, but it's actually run by Big Beverage and by folks who have a very vested interest in showing that caffeine is good for you. And so we think that those kinds of approaches are going to be the way that we make progress in this realm, and that if we don't identify those kinds of approaches, really this is never going to take off, right? Schools already, and teachers particularly, have so much being put onto their backs. We can't expect them to teach a whole new class that is separate. But what we might be able to do is identify key places in the curriculum where these crucial skills for citizenship in our present digital age can be used as leverage points to teach students these crucial skills. And if we do that, then we could hopefully begin to make a difference in this crucial problem that we all face in terms of how to make sense of online information. Just dropping into the chat here a link to the study, which has just appeared in the Journal of Educational Psychology. There is also a write-up of it and details some of the reactions of teachers as part of the study from the Wall Street Journal. And then finally, a little bit from the New York Times talking about how this approach of integrating the materials into the core subject areas could be a way forward. And then just finally, I'll note that all of these materials that we've used, both the assessments as well as the lesson plans, are available for free on our website, which is cor.stanford.edu. We've now had teachers log more than 250,000 downloads of those resources since the website launched 2 years ago. We also have a series of instructional videos and tools to support teachers and students in beginning to use these resources. Thank you so much. I look forward to some questions. Stefan, please.
Yes. Sorry, I did miss some. Is there somebody in the room who's asking a question first?
That's all right. I'm sharing. You can start, Stefan.
Okay. It's fascinating. I'm a big fan of this work, and I was wondering if you could give some more insights into what the obstacles are. So you mentioned that. So if I imagine there's a post-test, and maybe it's a couple of days or even weeks after the intervention, to do lateral reading, you first need to remember that you need to do it. And then assuming you remembered or you decided to do it, you need to do it right. And so these are kind of two necessary things to happen so that you find, for example, the fossil links. So I was wondering if you could say something about what's the bigger problem or maybe ways to address the two kinds of problems, remembering to do it at the right point in time and then doing it right once you do it.
Yeah, I think those are critical questions to raise. So in related work, we actually did think aloud interviews with a subset of students from the treatment groups. And so, and we did those think alouds before and after, and watching the students at post-test, it was really striking, right? That overwhelmingly they had the impulse to read laterally. And so that part is not as hard, but what we saw was that, you know, although the idea of lateral reading is pretty straightforward, actually doing it well is hard, right? And that for students who aren't as familiar with what they encounter when they are reading laterally, that it isn't always so easy, right? So, you know, for instance, we've seen students who read laterally about the Employment Policies Institute, right? The organization behind minimumwage.com. And they got onto the Wikipedia page that tells you very clearly that it's run by a PR firm, but they saw that that the organization had a pretty hefty budget. And so as a result, they said it was a good source of information, right? So like they didn't know really what they were looking for when they did it, or they ended up sort of not knowing the kinds of sources that would be more credible when they go there. And so I think all of that speaks to the need to give students opportunities to practice, and crucially have opportunities to discuss the process by which those evaluations are made. So not just saying like, go do another practice, but then to talk with a teacher and with other students about the kinds of sources you use, so that you build some content knowledge, right? That it's not just this algorithm of open new tab and look for information. It's also, you know, what kind of sources should I look for, and how do I do that effectively so that I'm not just spinning my wheels the whole time.
Yeah, because it's almost like an infinite regress problem, because then you need to start laterally checking the lateral sources to find out what you can trust, and that's not a good idea, right? So
no, exactly.
Kind of default.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And so it speaks to the need also of some of that content knowledge, right? So, you know, in another example, you know, some students, it's spent so much time because they had never heard of like Politico, which is a well-known news outlet in the United States. And so they spent time looking up that organization. Then they looked up the polling organization, right? And they're doing all these other things and they're engaged in lateral reading, but it's not really getting at the key issue, which is like, should I trust this website that's putting the information out there, right? So yeah, I think that the danger of the infinite regress is there. So yeah, students need more opportunities to build both the skills of doing it and also some content knowledge about what you encounter when you do that lateral reading.
So next is Anastasia.
Yeah. Hi, Joel. Another fan here. We are our group are big fans of your work. So I have two questions. One, first, I really liked how you call the 6 hours educational intervention a modest intervention. Of course, in the intervention space we are working, this is really not a modest. This is a lot of effort. You need to train all the teachers. Then you need to organize all these lessons and insert them in the curricula. So I imagine it's a lot of work to do that. Then, of course, when we think about like sort of referring back to the previous talk, how to translate this modest intervention into even more modest intervention, how to teach lateral reading heuristic quickly online as a strategy, then it becomes even more complicated. So maybe not an easy question is like, in your experience working with this, what are your thoughts? What is the crucial part of the 6 hour teaching process? Is there any shortcut, so to say, in your experience? What is the main thing here? So what I hear from you, there is like some sort of practices and experience plays an important role, right? But maybe, yeah. And just one follow-up, not follow-up on this, but another sort of comment. I was also thinking you have all these 12 teachers who you need to train, which is an investment of resources. Have you thought working with digital platforms that you just once record a course, such as on Coursera, so you don't need to reteach this particular persons, and people take this course? And that also solves the problem that different teachers might have different level of engagement with their students, so you sort of control for this. So that would be another question. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, so really good questions. Thank you so much. So I'll take up the last one first, which is about sort of how do we take this to scale, right? And I think that's a critical consideration without a doubt. So I'll just drop into the chat that we did create actually a MOOC for teachers in collaboration with colleagues at MIT. So that's although it's not being run at the moment, you can see the archive version of it there. And what we sought to do was both create videos with debriefs of how to think about doing these things, as well as a variety of simulations for teachers to think through the pedagogical implications of this, because as you note, it is an intense amount of work to do this, right? And I think it also speaks to the challenges of working in school environments, right? That it's really different than being able to run experiments online with relatively small amounts of where the time that participants are engaged with it is relatively short in comparison. But it also speaks to what we need to do, right? And that's not the only solution, right? Certainly we need a multifaceted approach to addressing this problem. But if we want it to be done in schools, we need to figure out ways to create curricular interventions. And so how do we do that? Well, there are a variety of issues. One is, teacher preparation. And I think that online courses like the one we developed are hopeful possibilities. I also think that we need to create materials that are classroom ready for teachers, so that they are not being asked to do this work, but being given tools that they can readily implement. In terms of the question of, what's the crucial bit of it, if nothing else, there's a disposition that is crucial here, right? Of just getting off of a page, right, is no small thing. That so often folks are just pulled in to the content that is in front of them. And so I think part of that is that just basic idea that I should leave unfamiliar sources online is a critical one. We have just done some pilot work where we made like a 90-second video and showed it to students, where we used a very sort of engaging example of somebody having been impacted by problematic content online, and then explained why, if you had just left the problematic content, you could have quickly found out more accurate information about it, and left students with the tagline of, get off the page. And we did pre-test and post-test with a short item using that minimumwage.com example, and then another website from Berman and Co., the same PR firm. And we saw a real improvement. And we went from 7% at pre-test to nearly 20% of students got it right, just from that 90-second video. So, I think it does suggest that there are ways with less time that we can see real improvement. And so if nothing else, it's about getting folks to have a different way of thinking about information online. And then we can work at trying to deal with some of those other issues that are a little more thorny in terms of building skills around searching effectively.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That's a really great answer. Thank you.
Next is Oliver Holmes.
All right. Yeah, thank you for the talk. That was very interesting. The question that I had was regarding the long-term effectiveness of this intervention. Have you tested how these students perform 6 months, a year afterwards, or do they need to then have a refresher course?
Yeah, we have not. It's a great question, right? We have not done examinations yet of the durability of these changes. And yeah, that's in terms of future research, I think that's a critical question to raise. It's also trickier just in terms of all of the logistics of working in school districts, but as, going forward, as more school districts begin to adopt these kinds of ways of teaching, it's one that we should be able to take up. But yeah, it's a really interesting question. What does this look like a year later, or even, as you say, six months later? How much of it has stuck with students? We don't know yet.
Thank you very much. If you don't mind, I did have one quick other question.
Sure.
Just regarding Stefan's comment about the whole risk of infinite regression, would like follow-ups with the students help in that regard? Because I get the sense that part of the issue with that is just an unfamiliarity with the sources that they're then looking up. So as they engage in more lateral thinking and they get more comfortable with which sources they can rely on, wouldn't you then lessen the risk of that occurring?
Yeah, without a doubt. Yeah, I mean that's exactly what we saw, right? That the students who had some more of that content knowledge did much better, right? I talked about that student who spent all this time looking up Politico and all these other sources. In contrast, there's another student who's like, Politico, I know who they are. Okay, and they're moving on, right? And they're able to do the same evaluation in much less time and much more effectively, right? So yeah, without a doubt that's going to support students. And I think that you're suggesting as well the way in which we can scaffold students thinking about these things, right? And helping them with some information about sources and things like that is a possibility as well.
Thank you. Next is Aksa Farouk.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. It was really, really interesting, and I echo everyone else that I'm a huge fan of the work you're all doing. I just wanted to ask about whether or not you had the chance, or maybe you did do this and I missed it, to look at sort of different topics. So you have a lot of like political things going on, but in order to distinguish whether the findings that you're coming up with in terms of young people and their ability to look for sources and evaluate credibility of websites, how much of that is their own ability and their own information and their own tools and resources that they either lack or they need to be trained on, or how much of it is a personal motivation or interest in the topic? So if it was something that had high stakes for them specifically, will they just be better at doing all of that sort of searching and credibility checking versus if they don't really have any kind of personal involvement or motivation in the topic area, then maybe it's more about would you have any idea of how to distinguish between whether it's a personal motivation factor or they just don't have the tools regardless of the topic?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question. We don't have results that speak to that, right? We don't have measures about students' particular interests, and I think it's really interesting possibility, right? Of how much is the amount of work that students were willing to do. I think that the results from the studies suggest that that students still do improve, right? And so that suggests that by providing them, that the topics haven't varied dramatically, and so once they have these skills, they do better at it. So that it's not just about motivation for students, that a big part of it is whether or not they have the skills. However, in terms of future research, without a doubt, there's the question of sort of the motivation to do it, as well as motivated reasoning, right? Of how much are people affected by their own beliefs and the way in which they engage with it. We're hoping to be able to do some research soon in a context where it'll be easier for us to collect information about students' political beliefs. That is harder to do in K-12 settings that in terms of getting that research approved, but we're hoping to be able to work in a university setting where we'll be able to get some of that data that will give us a better sense of the way in which people's personal beliefs interact with their evaluations of sources.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yes.
So I have a question. You mentioned the logistics of running studies in educational context, and actually we find ourselves in a similar position at the University of Brussels. We are running a project trying to understand like the impact of several interventions among populations with very low education. So I'm more, it was fascinating talk, but I'm more interested in the ethical aspects. You know, there is this discussion on RCTs and, you know, how do you deal with giving the treatment to one group? So I was wondering how you dealt with that, whether you thought about these ethical aspects and how maybe you dealt with them, you know, both at the personal level, but also since your article was published. Yeah, I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I think it's a crucial dimension of this, right? You know, especially as we have growing evidence of the efficacy of the, you know, we should be providing this support for students and teachers. So what we did was we provided the same professional development to the teachers in the control group at the conclusion of the study. And so the same professional development that the teachers in the treatment classrooms had received before the study, we gave that same professional development to the control teachers afterwards, so that everybody was going to have the same resources available to them. And as a matter of fact, the school district where this research was done has now adopted civic online reasoning across their history social studies curriculum, and they are figuring out ways to integrate it into other subject areas as well. So for us, we took that on by saying we're not going to provide to everybody right away, but we are going to make sure that at the end of the study that we provide this this kind of professional development to everybody. And in this particular case, the school district has chosen to take it on a larger scale.
Thank you. Yes.
Thanks, Joel. It's Alberto Bratti, US of Oxford. So after your talk, the first thought was I would really like to follow this fact check course. I'm sure it would be pretty bad. But my second thought was, how do people end up a little bit in this weird sources? So it seems to me that it's crucially different, the skill of understanding if you're consulting a not reliable source, or avoiding being exposed to this source. So I was wondering if these are two separate problems, or if maybe it was actually treated in the fact check course. Just your thought about it.
Sorry, so is the question about sort of avoiding information versus being able to find credible information? Is that it?
Avoiding unreliable sources versus recognizing unreliable sources.
Yeah, so we did not focus as much on giving students the sort of a set of things of avoiding particular issues. You know, what we were focused on more was equipping them with the tools to be able to identify, to evaluate things as they came across their screens, in part because that's so often how it happens, right? Is that if you pick up your phone, things pop up, right? And so how do you make a decision about the things that you're being presented with? So that was the frame that we went with. However, in the process, we are equipping students with ways to think about sources writ large. And so, ultimately that's going to help them to hopefully avoid problematic sources, and that as they do more of these kinds of evaluations, that they are going to begin to get a sense of like, that's a problematic one, right? And maybe not just the particular sites, but also genres, right? Of like, this is that kind of site, right? This is a hyper partisan site, and that's also really helpful for students too, is just to have a sense of the genre of sources that they encounter when they go online.
On this point, I'd like to jump in because on the topic of avoiding versus being able to recognize sources, there's an Italian researcher who has written a book, unfortunately, only in Italian, and he has a specific thesis that actually it's good that there is this information, in the sense that, so his thesis is that this information has always existed in the history of humanity. But the point is not to avoid it. The point is that by looking at this information, we can actually we can train our cognitive resources. I mean, I think it's a bit of a limited thesis, like maybe it doesn't work in general, but there is something to it. So on that point, it's possible that actually having to do the debunking, you know, we get better skills, like, in general.
Yeah, I think that's a possibility. And you know, Anastasia has dropped into the chat a link to a piece by my colleague Sam Weinberg about this idea of critical ignoring, right? That part of what we want to do is not engage deeply with every source that we encounter, right? Because we're living in an attention economy. And if we dive deeply into everything, you know, we won't have any time available. And what's most important is deciding whether or not a source is worthy of our time and attention before diving into it. And that's a really crucial difference between how the fact checkers approached information and those other smart folks did in Sam and Sarah's original research. And so I think that's an important frame for all of this, is the imperative to engage in attention conservation.
I think this might be a good point actually to open. Did you have a
just a comment? Actually, I'm not really sure if this is a question. Hi, this is Stephanie Rodriguez from the Pro-Social Design Network. So kind of following on this conversation, I just kind of wonder, you know, there's a level of sophistication to encountering certain types of content or sources and being able to deduce something so is risk. And I just do wonder if you're quite young to be able to assess whether something is a risk and the motivations somebody might have to fund something, for example. So having the tools is one thing, but again, it's kind of going back to this knowledge, take it one step further and go, this might be risky. That is, you know, something you develop over time as you learn why certain actors might be motivated.
Could somebody actually repeat that question? There was a little bit of background noise. I didn't catch all of it.
It was more of a comment. Sorry, is this any better?
Oh, got it. By all means, then I will let it go as the comment. My apologies.
No, no worries. Were you able to catch the comment?
No, I missed it. I'm sorry.
Okay, no worries. So I was just kind of commenting on how encountering certain sources, I think, requires a level of sophisticated thinking. And I wonder at, you know, younger ages, you might not be able to assess the risk associated with certain funding sources and why certain people might be motivated to fund something. And so it's one thing to say, like, let me look at this news source. It's another thing to assess and go, is this a good or a bad thing? And that, I think, is sometimes not always evident. And so, yeah, just a comment. I don't know how.
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting question, right? Is, you know, if there is some sophistication there in terms of understanding how those things work, right? And so, you know, and I think that is an important set of considerations, especially if we are going to try to integrate these ways of reasoning into school curriculum. So, you know, what do we do with younger students, right? You know, it's really important just to have this idea that I shouldn't trust everything that comes across my screen, and, you know, the deep analysis of everything, maybe that's coming a little bit later on, where we're you know, doing this additional work. But, you know, we have seen that younger students, 12 and 13-year-olds, you know, they can engage in some of these basic ideas of saying, like, who's behind this information? You know, how might that influence the content? You know, in general, we haven't asked them to be thinking about political action committees, but of saying, you know, like, oh, you know, this is coming from the Japanese embassy. You know, how might that influence what they're saying about things, right? And that students can get that idea that a you know, particular group is, you know, if that's sponsored content from the Japanese embassy, like, that might shape what's in there, right? And then, but I think going forward, we need to think about what works best with different ages.
So this is a good moment to open the workshop to the general discussion. So as you might have seen in the program, we left a bit of time at the end for this panel discussion. And my idea was exactly to open the discussion also to kind of general topics about this information. So please, anyone in the room or online, I will still be moderating, but please feel free to ask general questions that could be directed at any speakers. Of course, this is a little bit limited because some speakers had to leave, but we'll do what we can. I saw a hand. Oh no, that was a laughing maybe. So yes, please.
Might have a point of entry, which
absolutely
then develop from there. So a question that I kept having a look through the day was about what is the information that we want to target with these interventions. And I saw that through different studies, on a methodological point of view, the wording was quite different. It was accurate, it was scientifically valid, it was true. These are, I think, I mean, I'm talking to many philosophers, so you're much more attentive than economists probably to the use of wording. I think this is quite crucial in the sense that if you're asking me if a sentence is likely to be true or accurate, my answer can be quite different. And I made before the example to Nick about the article we saw by Liza Fazio saying that there are 30,573 false statements made by Trump publicly. So if I'm asked, do you think this information is true? I will tell you it's almost surely false. Because I mean, probably the number is going to be two more or three less, but is it plausibly close in a genuine sense to what happened? And I would say, yeah, probably yes. But I think, so what we want to measure, so scientific validity or accuracy, kind of matters to the conclusion we came to, and also to the kind of information that want to be targeted, because science is not black and white. I mean, we're probably disagreeing about a lot of things in our field. So yeah, it can be point of entry.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on that, and I totally agree. And I think that accuracy needs to be assessed based on what is relevant for the audience. And for instance, Trump might say something like totally false, but then what he wants to convey is not exactly the fact that X is true or X is false, but he wants to convey an attitude and a certain opinion about certain people or certain, matter of facts. And this opinion might, to his audience and to himself, be true in some sense. So it might be the relevance that matters more than whether it is actually accurate or scientifically accurate or not. It depends on the context that you put.
Any more?
There's Stefan.
Comments from, yes, Stefan, please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I wanted to make a comment that is similar to the one before about we need to be sure that we know what our target is, which makes totally sense. But people started out doing research, and it's almost like research on intuition or other things. Everybody has an idea what it is, but once you start looking at what people do, they do different things. And so I think it's very important that we clarify this. I think another part is that we should pay much more attention to how we create our stimuli. So people are very rightfully obsessed with populations of participants. Like, oh, is it a representative sample? Does it come from a capital letters weird population, like Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic, or other types? But I don't see the same. Ideally, when you do research and create your stimuli, you would create like a recipe that other people could replicate. Ideally, even automatically by a computer. Sometimes that's not possible, so that you at least know to what kind of stimuli you are generalizing to. And this, I think, will help make it easier to compare or generalize results across different kinds of groups and topics. So I think in some sense I'm arguing for the same level of obsession that we have with participant populations, also with the stimuli. And I don't only mean whether you have a headline or a source or not, or an image, or is it Facebook, or is it a WhatsApp group, but just more generally that that we are very specific about what's the reference class, what's the function that generates stimuli and could generate more of those kind of stimuli that we cannot test as many stimuli as we want to. There could always be more, but we should explain how you would go about getting more of those. And I think that would be very helpful, yeah, to think through more.
Yeah, so thank you, Stefan. I'm happy to report that Piero Folco, myself, and Simone and Tiffany, we did obsess quite a bit about the stimuli. So because we were working specifically with the science-related disinformation, actually, we were constantly challenged with the question, well, are we actually saying that this is scientifically valid, but can we also prove it? And of course, this is the toughest question for any scientist, I guess, but also philosopher of science. And I myself come from, not really from experimental sciences, I come from epistemology and philosophy of science. And so actually our work was really a bit across the disciplinary borders between epistemology, actually doing proper epistemology, and also setting up the experimental design. But I can see myself in your question, because we were really obsessing quite a bit about the stimuli. And I don't remember if in the paper we actually explained the technique that we use.
But exactly, that would be my point. So I'm glad that you're obsessing, but maybe I should rephrase. Obsessing is one thing, but is explaining to people in the same way that people publish code and data and the stimuli that they did use, like publish additional enough supplemental information or an algorithm, how those stimuli were created, and how you could create more of those. I think that would be very interesting. Kind of formalizing all the thinking that has gone before, that many people definitely do, but they don't communicate. It's really hard to understand how they came up with their stimuli. And that's what I was more after. I don't think people don't think about it enough, but they don't share it enough.
Yeah, as a philosopher, I don't think you can put it into an algorithm, but
let's not go there. But you can make a flowchart or a bullet point list or something that I mean, you don't need a Turing complete machine or something, but just something that's yeah. Now, otherwise, there is this 0800 critique from Alvin Roth, like, oh, if you want to interpret or reproduce a paper, you need to call up the researcher and ask, hey, how did you do it? Or can you make me more of your stimuli, right? And that's not what we want. So yeah, let's not get bogged down in theoretical computer science here.
Liam.
I'm sorry to have had to jump in and out today. We're just hiring this week. I just wanted to make a broad point about connecting the literature and misinformation, disinformation to broader literatures on the ethics of influence. And just thinking in terms of, as you sit and let these sort of talks wash over you, partly thinking, at what point do you care about some of these things, in the sense that, like, we all have opinions and we take information in different ways. And I was just trying to scroll through my head about the criteria for which you then start to think, no, this is going to cross over a threshold whereby there's going to be actionable harm. There's going to be, and we think about this a lot in regulation, for example, like the difference between the normal sort of tricksterism of marketing versus stuff that's a regulator should step in on. And I just want to put that out as a conversation, maybe over dinner or whatever. Like, are there points in your research where you've just went, hang on, this has moved from usual showmanship of presentation to being something where somebody's going to get killed, or even with consumer harm? Like, I find myself often in regulation thinking, somebody's going to spend a few quid more on a product, care, as opposed to somebody's going to be bankrupt or wiped out or end up in destitution because of a particular piece of misinformation or disinformation. So I just wanted to open that up as a discussion. And maybe folks, I know there's been literatures on deaths during COVID from misinformation around vaccines and things like that, but if people had other ones, I'd be fascinated to talk about it on the wings.
Yeah, this is kind of one of the main critiques that this information literature faces very often, which is like, how relevant is this really, right? And there's been much of a discussion about how much do people actually believe in the things they share. And there's very good points that some detractors have made about the actual extent of this phenomenon and the actual practical implication. But maybe we're kind of sidetracking this conversation, but I really have to stress this. It's not about a specific piece of information. It's just kind of a modus operandi. The way some information might eventually, the concept of black swans, the idea of like some rare but extremely meaningful, impactful events that may occur. So it might be that none of the information that we're actually looking at in social media might be actually very harmful or anyway viral, but there might happen, and eventually will, that will have some sort of piece of information that will be extremely successful in the penetration and in the way it could carry lots of meaningful implications, which is basically what happens. It has happened multiple times in history, that the ways of like false information or manipulated information somehow enacted, kickstarted a series of processes. So in news, potentially this is actually can have disastrous consequences. So it's more like it's not a matter of these specific cases and instances, but rather when these things will actually have snowball effects.
Oliver raised his hand.
Yeah, thank you. One of the points that comes to mind for me as I was listening to the different talks, and it's something that I've been considering a fair bit, is to what degree, do we feel that the research that we're conducting has external validity? Because like a lot of especially when we think of it in the context of like we're researching misinformation, how people interpret these headlines, but a lot of the focus that we seem to have is on like headlines or manipulations of that context, and it feels like a lot of the that a lot of what we're doing ignores the social aspects of social media, because like it's really helpful. Like I'm not downplaying the research because it's incredibly helpful to know how like these headlines influence people's behaviors, but often they're not viewing them simply in a vacuum. And I'm just wondering like what people's thoughts are on this.
Sorry, I'm always pinching in, but I totally agree with Oliver. That's it's kind of one of my main concerns when I first approached the literature, was that we're dealing with extremely succinct, stripped out pieces of information, and we should be doing more. The problem is we don't have access to most of the times to resources that allow us to make kind of context where we're testing more engaging. Now we've seen some examples and instances of collaborations or kind of facsimile replicas of social media, and that I think is a good direction. But yeah, this is something that probably the whole kind of field has to improve on.
Yeah. Was I first?
You fight it out.
Go ahead, John. I come back later. No, so I was just going to say one small thing. Like the study I presented earlier, the YouTube field study that we did. I don't want to say how much it costs, but it was absurd, and YouTube paid for it, basically, right? And that simply isn't feasible. Like we have to find a way to force social media companies to make these kinds of studies accessible and cheap, because it's not fair really that we have this collaboration ongoing that puts us at a massive advantage, right? I don't think that's reasonable at all. And I think that should be democratized immediately. if that can be done.
Let me follow to support
Yeah.
your point that in financial regulation, I'm not saying it's perfect, but it is relatively common for regulators to compel, at least in a very notional sense, companies to embed experiments within their platform. You look at the new regulations, what you're saying is eminently feasible, that if these were regulated correctly, that it would be simply mandated that there'd be some element to which they would have to at least demonstrate that there was principles around engagement with their platforms that were being externally verified via empirical studies. Is definitely, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know how it would be reported legally, but I can certainly think of lots of large banks who've been forced to, relatively hard way to embed this sort of stuff into their products.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It should be, I mean, YouTube doesn't lose money when they run an ad, right, on their platform. It's absurd that that's even a paid thing to begin with. So them saying we're doing you a favor by investing X dollars into your ad campaign, it's kind of weird. It's not really an investment on their part to begin with. So I'm not really seeing it as them doing us a favor or anyone a favor, but it's being framed as such, right? And there's these barriers that are being put up to doing this kind of research that really shouldn't be there, if you ask me. Worth discussing.
So following the same line of thoughts about social media in practice, and going a little bit back to the question of what information should we moderate or intervene on or not, I was wondering if it's public, what's the policy of social media companies, Facebook, Twitter, they intervene on some contents. Do we know what's the algorithm, what are the criteria explicitly used, because they have an incredible amount of information and they already intervene not as public policies, but as private policies. And I'm wondering if there is something that there can be some transfer there. I don't know. Is it absolutely obscure? I see a lot of people nodding, so yes, it's absolutely obscure. Okay.
99.9%. This is Oliver.
Yeah, I wonder if Oliver's, is your hand still up from?
Oh, sorry. No, it was, yeah, I just forgot to put it down. But yeah, thank you for the discussion though.
Next we'll discuss about Elon Musk.
I understand we're all tired, but I don't know if we want to talk.
No, of course not. It was just, if you feel brave enough at dinner.
Are there any more?
It was owned by what, Saudi or some Saudi Arabian oligarch?
Oh, that's
before,
true.
right?
That's
I mean, okay, let's not present as if the people previously owned Twitter were like amazing people. What can I say?
Any more questions or comments? Yes.
I'm going to switch a bit the focus, but I mean, I fully agree about what has been discussed. So another thing that relates to your first question about the differences of different measures, which I think also relates to your presentation, and I mean the fact that I caught my attention of binary measures behaving somewhat differently from to some extent. I think it might be interesting to also look a bit at how like users or people represent these things, and it also links a bit to the relevance question of what is relevant to them, how do they represent truth, and look a bit also at simultaneous measures of not only how do people assess the information, but what impact does it have. And of course, this links back to the discussion of social media making data more available and making it easier for us to measure things on their platforms. But I think it's interesting also from a more theoretical perspective to, especially for the philosophers and the epistemologists in the room, to think about these things, like what does it mean in the end, whether people believe misinformation and how they assess it, and how relevant is it for them after all?
Yeah.
I don't have a clear idea about that. Are there any philosophers that want to comment?
We did this one study recently, which I think I already said this to Volko earlier. It was a study where we had a really large survey of the UK, 16,000 people or something. And we administered the misinformation susceptibility test, right? And we basically had everyone's postcode, pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
And what we wanted to see was, okay, so does someone's performance on this misinformation susceptibility test, is that an independent predictor of vaccine uptake, which you can know by postcode, basically. And it was like a really robust predictor. So basically how likely someone is to believe fake news predicts later sort of actual vaccine uptake. So that's, I think that's a strong argument in favor of saying we really do need to tackle misinformation susceptibility somehow. And not just the behavior, but rather the construct of susceptibility. If that can be improved, there's a theoretical link between that and real world behavior. And empirical link as well. It remains to be seen whether any intervention that tackles susceptibility actually also increases vaccine uptake, because that link I'm not so sure about, but in theory it does exist.
Yeah, I think it's, so this is not published yet. Right?
No, it's being written up.
It's very interesting. But there is always the question of causality, and is it like that people already have misconceptions and that's why they consume misinformation? So maybe just vaccine hesitants are more likely to consume misinformation. So I think there still needs to be a lot of like causal work on the impacts. But yeah, I do agree that it's a very interesting approach and a very good starting point.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. It was an independent predictor when you consider things like political affiliation, region where they live, age, gender, education level, et cetera, these kinds of things.
Right.
It's independent, but I'm not 100% sure to check if it's also independent of prior vaccine hesitancy. That's a very good question. I don't exactly know that. I'll check with the lead author who's writing it up.
Great. Well, I think if there are no further questions or comments, I think we can call it today. It's been a long day, but it's been really great. At least I enjoyed it a lot. Thank you everyone here in the room and online for participating with your questions, your comments, and especially to all the speakers, even those that are not here anymore. But thanks for all your presentations. Thank you everyone, also to the local organizers again for helping with this. And hopefully we'll have the chance to talk more about these topics in other venues in the near future. So thank you again.